Introduce our second speaker, Devera Saxton, who is joining us from California. Devera is an associate professor at California State University, Fresno. She actually went to Hartwick College as an undergrad and then came to American University for her doctoral program. She does a lot of, I think, race, gender, social justice, works in areas of medical, environmental, anthro, food and agriculture, environmental and social justice, environmental health. And she's going to talk about, she and the team of anthropologists and the community-based organization leaders together were co-winners of the 2021 Praxis Award for their work on collaborative anthropology and the COVID-19 farm worker study. So it's an ongoing project. It is a collaborative rapid response research to action project collecting critical missing information on farm workers' lived experiences during the pandemic. And I think rather than going any further with an introduction, I'm going to turn this over to Devera. Devera, thank you for being here to talk with us tonight. Please look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks, Bill. This is Devra here, reporting from Fresno, California in the San Joaquin Valley, which is about, and I'm sorry for the noise. I'm in a little bit of a time crunch because I'm running from many classes and I've got one more to do tonight. So I'm squeezing you in between working with first generation students, and my dog and other stuff. So excuse my chaos over here, but such is life in the San Joaquin Valley. So you get a little soundscape with your evening. I was one of 3 anthropologists that was involved with the COVID-19 farm worker study. I'm also I call it my secret job. If I could, I would do it full time, is researcher with the California Institute for Rural Studies. And they were the ones that really instigated this project in March of 2020. The late founder of California Institute for Rural Studies, Don Villarejo, who was trained as a physicist, but ended up contributing systems analysis and administrative data analysis work to the UFW movement, United Farm Workers Union movement in the 60s and 70s, is our founder, and he helped us set up our sampling strategy for California and then Oregon and then Washington. As we all acknowledged our grave concern about farm worker communities and their vulnerability to COVID, even as we weren't super clear on it back in March, April of 2020. But the California Institute for Rural Studies has been doing research to action with rural and farm worker communities in California for over 40 years. The COVID-19 farm worker study is the latest, and it's about to come to a close this December, which I'll talk about in a bit. We started in California with 915 surveys with farm workers, and we sampled in regions with high concentrations of agricultural workers, and then replicated that strategy in Oregon and Washington. And rather than having the anthropologists and research partners doing the data collection, we worked with key community-based organizations that have direct relationships with farm workers in all 3 states, and they executed the surveys and then later the in-depth interviews in California and Oregon. In California, we did them from August to October 2020 with about 63, including 14 indigenous language farm workers, namely speakers of Mixteco, Zapoteco, and Triqui, which are languages spoken in Oaxaca, mostly in Oaxaca, but also in Guerrero and Puebla. In Oregon, and Washington State, there are also a lot of Mam and indigenous language speakers of Mam and other languages from Guatemala who were part of the study. Later in the year, when we realized with Delta and then Omicron that things were not getting better for farm workers despite successful vaccination campaigns in our 3 states, relatively successful. I think in part due to the data we collected and the pushing and hustling of the community-based organizations across the states. But things just seem to intensify with all these other variables too that were going on, inflation, and the rising costs of food, but also reduced work hours for agricultural workers and food workers, despite cries of labor shortages in industrial agricultural zones in our region. Those are largely fabricated because mostly the workers we spoke to talk about and continue to talk about into the present day that they don't have enough hours to make a living, and that's compounded by inflation. But largely the cries of labor shortages are about wanting to get money to mechanize agriculture further and to bring in guest workers in the new Bracero program. Through the US and Canada has their own version. So our last phase, we aimed to have conversations during Delta, but it ended up happening in the tail end of Omicron because the community partners were continuing to do these sessions of emergency response, including in Washington State. They had to respond to atmospheric major flooding as the result of an atmospheric river, the result of climate change. So a lot of their farm workers were displaced and under threat from flooding. So this past spring, we had informal plática conversations with a smaller subset of farm workers affiliated with the various community-based organizations. And I want to talk about the results of all of this, but our key findings amidst the height of the pandemic were revolved around work, households, and health. And our one of our main recommendations was that farm workers and community-based organizations are the ones with the knowledge that we need to push good policies forward, to push more equitable and responsive, reactive, and accessible resource distribution and emergency response forward. Unfortunately, while there have been some moves towards increased language access around Spanish and indigenous languages in California, Oregon, and Washington, I still feel like there's significant top-down and not very well thought out, not very grounded emergency responses to the many different problems faced by rural communities in our 3 states. But during the pandemic and prior to the pandemic, the rights of agricultural workers were not always respected due to uneven enforcement of protections and uneven protections. An example of this could be in California when the governor distributed masks. It was kind of a one-time deal at one of the waves of the pandemic, and they were disposable masks. So they, when you work in the fields, you get sweaty and they break and fall apart, and then you have nothing. So that's what I mean when I talk about not very ungrounded implementation of emergency response efforts. Food workers, farm workers were laid off, and particularly women, because they had to stay home and take care of their children when all of the schools were closed. And so they were down by one income, and then hours were cut even more because a lot of the commodities weren't being distributed the same way. That being said, I just looked at a lot of stats for economic growth in agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley. And most of the counties around here grew economically, had profits of increases of at least 5%, but up to 12 to 15%. So people made money while this was happening, but you would not know it by communing with farm worker communities who do not reap the benefits of that. In the household level, people were experiencing heightened stress, which exacerbated other health conditions that they have, like diabetes and high blood pressure. Children were psychically distraught, and their parents struggled to help them cope and make meaning of what was happening in the world, which was also compounded by too much information, bad information, and just inconsistent information. It was hard to make ends meet, and in rural communities in particular, it's not always easy to access the supports and emergency response that is being offered, with lack of transportation and not the best communication strategies to reach rural agricultural worker communities. People also were very worried about getting sick, and in Fresno County, Hispanics and Latinos, their #1 cause of death for 2020 went from cancer to COVID-19. They were the most impacted demographic in the region, in part due to their working and living conditions, not being able to choose to socially distance, not being given the protective equipment that they should have been given, and having employers in a politically conservative part of California that were COVID deniers or dismissive of people's need to take time off of work or access. Eventually we passed sick leave, but not everybody was able to access that. Also uncertainties about testing and access to care, very similar parallels to Olive's work with Ebola in West Africa, distrust of healthcare institutions as well, which is learned and earned in this region from decades of discrimination and economic exclusion from access to healthcare. So right now, our tri-state team is reflecting back on these past 3 years and mobilizing this framework that I used in my book pre-pandemic, The Devil's Fruit: Farm Workers' Health and Environmental Justice. And we've just sort of expanded it to reflect the realities of COVID. And at the same time, in 2020 and 2021, we had really severe wildfires, which were also a compounding factor. Exposure to smoke. Workers are often forced to rescue crops like wine grapes so that the wine grapes don't taste, so your wine doesn't taste smoky. But workers are coughing up black saliva after work as a consequence of being forced to labor under hazardous air conditions. So we think of climate change and COVID and agriculture as a harm industry, but all of these things combined are threat multipliers in the lives of the people we've been working with. And all of these things came through in their interviews and survey data. And while it's tempting to want to isolate variables and just focus on one thing, in my work, and it's remained true through this study, I argue that we can't, and we have to accommodate models to think through these multi-layered threat multipliers and have holistic and grounded strategies for addressing them. And the work of my colleagues in Washington and Oregon, particularly a PhD candidate at Portland State in policy affairs, I think, Jenny Martinez, talks a lot about the coping and mutual aid strategies that farm workers mobilized, not just in their US communities, but also binationally, because they were also caring for kin in Mexico and Guatemala as well. So some outcomes in California over the past several years include media and legislative engagement, multiple reports, including a report focused on Indigenous farm workers during the pandemic, and a qualitative report, a revolution or an evolution in how California Institute for Rural Studies is conducting community-driven research to action work. In prior decades, the model had been to outsource research to professional researchers, and then to bring the data back and then translate it into policy recommendations or actions. But we've really shifted even from within COFS when we were working with a lot of outside researchers at the beginning to do that rapid survey early on. And then this year, we're writing poetry with farm workers to represent and reflect on their many layered experiences. And so they've become data dissemination and creative collaborators with the finale of the closing of this project. A working group, Campesinos, which is farm workers in Spanish, and agencies moving policy opportunities, Campo. We have farm workers and community orgs meeting with agencies like Cal OSHA and the Department of Industrial Relations to try to really troubleshoot and fix a lot of the gaps in enforcement and in policy that are perpetuating harm in farm worker communities and in workplaces. And that's with two of the CBO groups from California. In Oregon, they've also had media and legislative engagement. Their team is working on a podcast series that should come out soon, which is also giving power back to farm workers and community-based orgs to tell the stories. So that was funded by the Ford Foundation. They've established a Mesoamerican languages network to do the footwork to get support and infrastructures of care for Indigenous language farm workers. And at least 2 PhD dissertations by BIPOC scholars came out of the Oregon COFS data as well. And in Washington, the data was used to leverage resources for food, from food and agricultural industries. It helped build a new independent union, Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia, in the apple packing houses near Yakima, I think. They also are working on a statewide language access plan and were able to mobilize data to support vaccine dissemination. And they continue their work around organizing around climate resiliency and emergency response, especially post fires and post last year's flood. And we may be getting more floods this year as anticipated with La Nina and more atmospheric rivers. Collectively, we produced a Spanish language infomercial to share results with farm workers and motivate them. We've had Farm Worker Awareness Week social media campaigns and days of action. We've continued to mobilize around the 12 demands that came from farm workers' voices and the data we collected. And our last closing project is Video Poemas, where farm workers and younger community organizers and health promoters from our community partners in the 3 states. With the Platica data, we started to see poetry. And so we created these narrative prose poems from the different quotes from the Platica conversations. We solicited and paid for voiceover work from farm workers and photography from the field. So they're farm worker selfies and just landscapes and other images that they capture with their cell phones as part of their daily life. So they've really become, in the end, the authors of this work. And I feel very proud of that, of having supported the facilitation of that. And I will make sure to invite you all via bill to our Posada de Poesía, which the public one will be in, I think, the December 16th, whatever the Friday is after my finals. That's when it is, but I'll let you all know. So we played, anthropologists were part of this project. in a lot of ways. We were part of this bigger ecosystem of study designers, facilitators, archivists, ghostwriters, providing cover at press conferences when it wasn't safe or strategic for CBOs to share the results, listening, teaching and mentoring next generations of researchers, and also instilling research strategies for folks without formal training. We became co-poets and continue to be accompaniment friends and neighbors to farm workers and community partners, because we all live in the same communities. We just have different job titles. So I'm sorry it's so tiny, but this is a list of our partners across the tri-states, along with California Institute for Rural Studies. I thank you all for your attention and interest, and for your faith in our work and granting us the WAPA Prize last year or this year. I don't know what year it is anymore, but thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks very much, Deborah. Appreciate that. So if we have time for a question or a comment now. If there are any, you can just unmute or put it in the chat. Okay. Deborah, thank you. That built on the last the iteration from Salt Lake City, and really brought us up to the current time. You all, it's good to see the good work that you all are continuing to do out west with all of the challenges, but with all the potential that you're building. So thank you. Okay. It's now a pleasure. We're gonna we've gone from epidemic to pandemic to, I'm not quite sure how to characterize dangerous speech. I think Kathy will help me with the right word for this.
Infodemic.
Infodemic. Thank you. I knew Kathy had the word for this. So I'm really looking forward to having you all have an opportunity to listen to Kathy. Kathy is a Praxis person. She's also was really generous and came to St. Mary's College last spring and did a public talk, but then also led a workshop for students and faculty on this issue of how to address hate speech online, which was really, really useful. But let me tell you a little bit about Kathy. So Kathy started in anthropology at American University. I always enjoy saying that name, and did very well there, and then went on to Corvallis, Oregon for her master's in applied anthropology. She worked with housing and food insecurity among vulnerable Oregon communities and kind of minored in urban health policy. She's very interested in human rights, both as an advocate and an activist, and went and finished her PhD in anthropology from the University of Connecticut, is now back in the Washington, D.C. area working for the Dangerous Speech Project. And Kathy, I hope, will tell us a little bit about the Dangerous Speech Project. I'll just say that it focuses on global responses to dangerous and hateful speech, as well as the process of identity formation among those who choose to respond to such speech. So, and in her spare time, from her professional work, her family work, she is the managing editor for the Journal of Human Rights and an editor on Teaching Human Rights Database, and probably still affiliated with University of Connecticut's Economic and Social Rights Research Group. So here is another very energetic professional anthropologist to tell us about her work. Kathy, please, you're welcome to take over now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And before I start, I just want to say that I have so enjoyed hearing the first two presentations. What fantastic work. I was feeling really excited about my project until I heard about their work, and mine feels very, very tiny compared to that. So it was great and humbling at the same time. So let me dive right in. I'm going to share my screen here. Always takes me just a second to get things set up. All right, everyone can see that, I assume. So yes, my name is Kathy Berger, and I'm the Director of Research at an organization called the Dangerous Speech Project. The project I'm going to tell you about today is one that we call the Anti-Hate Brigade. So how a group of thousands responds collectively to online vitriol. The organization that I work for, the Dangerous Speech Project, is a very small NGO. It's based in the DC area. And the main purpose of our organization is to study the relationship between public speech and intergroup violence. So we define dangerous speech as any form of expression that can increase the risk that people will commit or condone violence against members of another group. The work for this project began when our current executive director did research into the public speech that preceded historical incidents of mass violence, and found that there were these really striking rhetorical patterns that existed in the kind of speech and the way that groups talked about the other, right? The way that they made violence seem acceptable and necessary. So that was kind of the original guiding idea of the organization. And now a lot of our work is focused on productive responses to such speech, often online, because that's where we're seeing this great spread of public speech these days. And so as the Director of Research, a lot of my work has been focused on something we call counter speech. So counter speech is any direct response to hateful or harmful speech which seeks to undermine it. Like I said, we're often looking at this online these days, although it can happen in person, obviously. Counter speech is something that you hear people promote frequently. You especially hear tech companies and other policymakers talk about the importance of counter speech, in part because it allows us to respond to speech that we think is ugly or unkind, harmful or dangerous, while sidestepping this sticky question of freedom of expression, right? It does not involve censoring or any kind of content moderation. It says, well, why don't we let the marketplace of ideas play out, right? Let's let the people decide what kind of speech is acceptable or not. Now, there are lots of issues with that are kind of outside of the scope of my presentation today, so I'm just going to leave that there. And I'm going to focus on a different question, which is, it's great that we can promote counter speech as a possible solution. The problem is, what can research tell us about whether or not it actually works, right? Does it even work? Does it accomplish the goal that we think we would like it to, which is to change the discourse that we're seeing online, to push back against hatred and dangerous speech, and to promote more kind of positive speech norms? Now, when we started looking into this as an organization, obviously the first thing that any good researcher does is a review of the literature. And I can tell you there's not too much explicitly on counter speech, although we did find other work that we felt was very relevant. And these are some of the overarching lessons that we took from that. First of all, it's very difficult to change someone's mind who is posting hatred online with counter speech, right? As humans, we're remarkably good at kind of ignoring any opinions that run counter to what we already believe. We're good at finding reasons not to believe that. But we know that it is possible. There are very famous cases of this happening. Megan Phelps Roper, who's the granddaughter of the founder of the Westboro Baptist Church, is someone you may have heard of before. She famously left that church, which preached hatred and picketed funerals, after being counterspoken to on Twitter. So we know that there are these high profile cases. There are many others that are not as high profile. So it is possible, but it's unlikely. The number of counter speakers also matters, right? So how many people are taking part in this practice, and the tone that they're using, their personal characteristics, all of this plays a role in whether or not those interactions are successful at changing someone's mind or their behavior. Now, what quickly also appeared from this work was the kind of research that was being done was almost completely quantitative work. These were applied mathematicians, some communications scholars, political scientists, some physicists that were looking at very large amounts of data, specifically just looking at the discourse, not looking at kind of the people producing the discourse. They were using machine learning to kind of gather lots of speech and say, well, how can we tell if there are changes in kind of the sentiment score, right? Is the speech getting better or is it getting worse? And once they were able to determine that, they felt like they had answered their research question, publish it, move on. Now, from my perspective and from the perspective of others at my organization, this was missing a big piece of it, right? Because it was missing the people who are actually involved in those interactions. Here's a good example. There are a few striking, they're small studies, but they have some very interesting findings that suggest that counter speech can lead to more counter speech, right? So regardless of what impact it has on the person who has posted something hateful, we see that once someone interjects with something challenging it, there's more of that kind of speech after it. Now that's really interesting, but these studies have so far not been able to say why that happens. We don't know why it does it. We don't know how it does it, right? That's more of a question for an anthropologist. We also found that most of these studies did not have a good grounding for what they mean when they say, does counter speech work, right? What were kind of the boundaries for what was considered a successful counter speech interaction? It was generally focused explicitly on this kind of large body of text. Does the sentiment score change? Or something very specific, like does the person who initially posted that hateful thing, is there a measurable kind of visible impact in what they choose to post later? But outside of that, there wasn't kind of investigations of the impact of counter speech on kind of general feelings about being online. What does it mean to be online? So these are some of the questions that really got us thinking that qualitative work could be useful in this case. I started my work by just looking for kind of as many counter speech efforts as I could find around the world. And when I say efforts, I mean that really, really broadly. So some of these are really glossy PR campaigns that might even have the funding of governments. Others are people who work as accountants or teachers. One person kept telling me, I don't know why you want to talk to me. I'm a hockey mom, right? So they do that during the day, and then they come home and hop on their phone and habitually respond to xenophobic comments or racist comments when they see them. So I'm looking kind of at lots of different kinds of people in this initial survey, and did 54 different interviews with different projects, again, from around the world, asking questions like, how do you decide what to respond to? How do you decide when you don't want to respond? Like how do you choose what to say, when to say it? What makes you get started with this? What challenges do you face? All of these kind of basic questions that you're asking about process, about strategy, decision-making, things like that. Now, through this process, I met this woman, Mina Dennert. So Mina Dennert was born in Iran and immigrated to Sweden when she was very young. And she had grown up experiencing, as she talks about it, kind of run-of-the-mill xenophobia, right? But she felt like it was always something that came from the usual suspects, far-right people online or something like that. And she started to become concerned when in 2015 and 2016, and if you remember, this is the time when there was a huge influx of migration and asylum seekers coming out of the Middle East into Europe, many going to Sweden. And she started to see these comments now coming from people that she had always thought of as, quote, good people. And that really worried her. She started to feel that Sweden was changing. And she wanted to do something. And so she tried to start responding online when she would see these comments, but it didn't really work, right? She either felt like her comments were getting lost in the sea of toxic speech, or those people were turning their hatred against her directly, right? And this was not a good experience for her. So she decided to gather 20 of her friends in a private Facebook group, and they decided that they would do this together. So they looked for comment threads that had hatred and xenophobic comments in those comment threads. They were often in the comments below newspaper articles that were reporting about asylum seekers coming to the country. And then they would go onto those threads together and all write their own counter speech comments. And here's the trick. They would also like each other's comments. Now, on public Facebook pages like newspapers, comments are ranked by engagement, not chronological order, which means the comments that have the most likes and replies float to the top, and the comments that have the fewest sink to the bottom. Their goal was to have all of the top comments, the first comments you see when you're scrolling through your Facebook page on an article like this, that you would see positive, fact-based, civil comments and not hateful ones, right? That was their goal. This project really started taking off. They started finding success. They got a little bit of press, and her group of 20 people now has 70,000 people in it in Sweden. The group has been replicated in 15 other countries, including the United States, if anyone is interested. And there are now over 150,000 people who are part of one of these groups around the world. The groups are called I Am Here. Each of the countries' names is the words I am here in their own language. So Mita and I started talking about doing research because I found their model just really intriguing. And it was unique because many of the counter speech efforts I found kind of sprang up for a little bit of time and then faded away. And hers has been going on for many, many years, and again, continues to grow, and people continue to participate. And so we decided we were going to develop this collaborative project that would both serve our research interests as an organization and also help their organization answer some key questions that they were hoping to answer. We were really interested in questions about effectiveness. You know, what are people doing that they think works? How are they defining success? How are they making decisions? What strategies are they using? Mina was far more interested in questions like, how did people decide to get involved? What makes them keep wanting to do this? You know, this is not fun work. This is hard work. Why would anybody want to do this day in and day out? She's also interested in learning kind of, have people do they feel like they've changed by being a part of this? What do they like? What do they not like? Initially, we felt like these questions were kind of two different sets of questions. And what was interesting is that as we started getting results back from the interviews and the observation, we started to realize that the answers were answering kind of both of them simultaneously, that our questions were not as far apart as we initially thought. So for the methodology, obviously this is different because it's online, right? I'm trying to do all of this research online, which actually was rather convenient because it was happening during the pandemic. But there was a lot of participant observation of joining each of these individual Facebook groups, kind of watching their processes day in and day out, the rituals that they have, the way that they speak to each other, how many people are participating at what times, all of these kind of basic daily life questions. Taking part in what they call actions, which are where they post links to comments and people go and write counter speech and like comments. And then for figuring out who to interview, we tried to kind of put together a sampling frame, which I'm going to put in air quotes here, because these groups are interesting places, right? They're interesting communities. The Swedish group has 70,000 people. The German group has 50,000 people. The UK group is also very large. Some of them are very small. The Canadian group has a couple hundred people. And so there are a lot of people in these groups, but not all of them are actively participating on a day-to-day basis. Some joined the group just because they heard about it and thought it was cool, but they've never kind of come back to it again. And I wanted to make sure I wasn't just interviewing the people who knew kind of the administrators of the group, trying to figure out how to get some sense of diversity within the group, diversity of opinions and experiences. So we again made a sampling frame of everyone who had participated in something. So had they liked a post or commented on a post over the course of a 2-week period. And then from within that sampling frame, sent out invitations that were randomly selected. Many people did not get back to me because all of these invitations are happening over Facebook Messenger, right? Because that's where all of the communication happens for these groups, is on Facebook. Some people did get back to me, and then I would send out more invitations until I had done enough interviews that I felt like I had reached saturation. I also did interviews with group administrators, so targeted interviews with like moderators and the people that actually keep these groups running on a day-to-day basis. And then other contextual interviews, people who understood the media landscapes in the various countries, people who could speak to potentially the impact, or at least the perceived impact that the groups were having. We weren't actually measuring impact, we were just looking at kind of perceptions of impact. And there were some kind of striking findings that I'll tell you about, at least they were striking for us. The first one related to what does it mean for counter speech to work? So if you go back to what I was saying earlier, most research on counter speech is really based off the changes in discourse as a whole, or in looking at the changes on what we call the original speaker, right? The person who posted the bad speech. What was interesting is that in doing interviews with counter speakers, both within the I Am Here network and the other ones that I spoke to as part of the larger global survey, almost none of them said they were trying to do either of those things explicitly, right? Many people said there's no point in speaking to people who are posting hatred online because you're not going to change their mind. But there's a recognition that when you speak online, your speech is visible by hundreds of other people who are going to encounter that speech, and that there's a power in responding, in dissenting to that view, right? There's an idea that you would be able to reach what they call the silent readers, a group that's often referred to as the movable middle by advocates, right? People who might not hold terribly strong views about a particular topic, and so therefore they can be swayed one way or the other. Makes them more susceptible to things like dangerous speech or hateful speech, but it also makes it more possible to kind of shift them in the other direction. They also, and this was something that was really new, said that they were speaking to people who they felt like probably already agreed with them, but that did not feel brave enough to speak up themselves. And this is something that I'll come back to on the next slide again. So here's a quote from one person who said, even if you write an answer for that side, meaning the speaker, the original speaker, everyone else can read it too. If you go into a place where a lot of bad things are written, then people say, oh God, that's what everyone thinks. But that's not what everyone thinks. A lot of people think differently, and that's important. Another person said, well, and I asked, who are you writing for? Well, the ones who read the comments. It's meaningless to start a discussion with someone who's really writing racist comments. It's meaningless. It's more important to show those who read the comments that there's opposition. So there was a real feeling that how counter speakers were defining success was not matching up with how most researchers were defining success when they were trying to test whether these methods were, quote, successful. Around the question of why do people join these groups, there was a real feeling that people join counter-speaking groups because doing counter-speech as part of a collective made people feel braver and not alone. They were more willing to go into tough spaces because they had the group figuratively behind their cyber back, which I love that phrasing. A lot of people talked about trying to counter-speak alone before learning about these groups and feeling really unsafe, feeling very discouraged. And then seeing the hashtag I am here, which is what members of these groups often tag their comments with. They'll write hashtag I am here at the end of their comments. Seeing those and realizing that there were other people who also did not agree with this hateful speech and feeling more comfortable responding to it. This person says, if there are a lot of really mean comments and people are attacking each other, then I would put on the hashtag like armor. It adds a level of protection. And I think what was interesting about this idea was this, again, was a question that was really responding to Mina's provocations, wanting to know, why do people join these groups? And it was a place where we saw our two areas of questions, our two areas of interest coming together in a way that we had not anticipated. I wrote here that this kind of research, these findings added explanatory support for studies like Miskolci's. So there's a study where they documented that once they interjected in the study, they were interjecting counterspeech into comment threads, and they noticed that there was more counterspeech after their original interventions than in the comment threads where they did nothing. But they couldn't really say why that was happening. They could just say that it did. For me, this is a great explanation, right? Many of the people whom I spoke with talked about the idea that it's so hard being the first dissenting voice. Not only because you have to be the first one who's going against the crowd of what, especially when you're challenging misinformation and disinformation, but more so also if you are alone, you are the target of kind of any repercussions that come from the people posting that hateful speech. They're going to turn that vitriol on you. But when you're with a group, when you're among other people who are counterspeaking, you no longer have that target kind of solely on your back. You are in some ways less visible as an individual, even though your speech becomes more amplified and more visible. And then why do people stay, right? People talked about the idea that these interactions on social media can be really unpredictable and very stressful when you don't know what you're going to encounter. But within these closed Facebook groups, it was very predictable. They had formed communities around values and around a way of speaking to each other, almost around discourse norms. And those interactions were predictable, and they were strong enough to make people feel a very strong sense of kinship and affinity for these groups, even though almost no one that I had spoken with had ever met another member in person, right? These are all online interactions. They did not have any kind of personal interaction beyond being a part of these groups together. And yet they felt very emotionally connected to them because they understood they shared the same values about how we should speak to one another online. They described these Facebook pages as a resting place or a place to charge your batteries. They also brought up the importance of the other kind of rituals and practices that the groups have integrated, such as things they call love bombing or well-wishing Wednesdays. This is the idea that one day a week, many of the groups have instituted a practice where they take one day off from responding to bad speech and spend the day responding to good things that are happening in their community. So they'll choose one person in their community who is doing really good work, and they'll, marshal all of their members to go and send thank you notes or to send little things online to love bomb their Facebook pages and thank them for their work. And those are incredibly popular. And so even though people come here to do this hard work of challenging hatred, these love bombing or well-wishing Wednesdays posts often have more engagement than the counter-speaking ones. Some of the groups have gone beyond that. This is the German group. They have developed a sister page called the Happy Place for Ich bin hier, where they post a collection of delightful memes, only happy things. I really like this arm extensions one down here for the T-Rex is hugging. And so this is a place that is supposed to be completely protected from all of the bad things on the internet, where people can go and have a little mental respite. So just to conclude, the outcomes of this research, although it was rather small in scale, I mean, we're not a big organization. We were really, this is kind of like my manpower, going into this work. The outcomes were able to kind of inform 3 different groups of stakeholders. So obviously the information was fed back into both I Am Here, their network, in thinking about the kinds of things that they pour their energy into. Certainly not going to stop the well-wishing Wednesdays practices or other kind of feel-good practices, for lack of a better term, but also in the findings have been useful. I've heard from other civil society organizations that are training counter speakers. I also have had many interesting conversations with quantitative researchers who are now trying to kind of shape their studies to be more responsive to what counter speakers are actually trying to do. I have a chapter coming out with an applied mathematician actually where we're arguing that there needs to be more kind of interdisciplinary work that brings together qualitative insight and quantitative scaling for the research when we're looking at the impact of something like counter speech online. Because I can't do the kind of work that my colleague does when he, you know, brings together thousands of pieces of text through machine learning, and he doesn't have the ability to do, or at least not the interest in doing the kind of work that I have done. And then the last stakeholder group, which I put on here, are tech companies. So tech companies are obviously always very interested in talking to civil society actors. I'm not always convinced that they are interested in listening to us, but it's a nice little box that they can tick. And I think there's some reason to be slightly skeptical about their interest in counter speech, because it does kind of help them move away from responsibility for what is on their platforms, but there has been interest from them as well in the research. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't go over time too much, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
That's great. Thank you, Kathy, very much. Kathy, I think there was a question that already came through on the chat. I'll just read it. Do you remember how many interviews you had to do to reach saturation?
Yeah, it actually wasn't very many with this group, which was kind of interest in itself. I did 24, and then I did a few more after that because I was so convinced that it couldn't have been that low. But they were very very kind of united in their feelings about things, which was also interesting when thinking about kind of how cohesive the group was around their beliefs about their practices and their role. The one thing that I didn't mention in the presentation was that the group did have rather strict protocols for how they respond to speech. So some of my questions about kind of strategy and things were easily answered because they have kind of official rules that they're supposed to follow. Although whether they always follow them is another question, more easily answered through observation, I think.
I have a question.
Yes, Suzanne, please go ahead.
Yeah. How do political differences fit into this? Because I can't imagine that all the counter speakers agree on everything. So how does that work out? I understand they're trying to counteract hate speech, but it seems like it could get messy.
Absolutely. Well, and so I can speak kind of for the wider group of counter speakers that I spoke to, because there are a lot more differences there, I think. And there are especially differences in kind of what people feel like is an appropriate response. So the I am here groups are all, like I said, rather uniform in the way that they respond. They're pretty disciplined in being polite and civil and, you know, citing statistics, and one of their rules is to not make fun of other people's grammar, which is something that happens a lot in counter speech, right? But when you look at kind of the wider survey of how people are responding to hatred around the world, there are not those rules, and some people are very openly mocking or outing, you know, doxing people who violate what they consider to be kind of acceptable speech online. And there is a real question about kind of what do we consider to be hateful? There is not an agreed definition on what hate speech is at all. And you even do run into problems with that within the I am here groups, about sometimes people will propose. So the way it works is that group members can kind of submit potential articles to comment to the moderators, and then they choose what they are going to send out. The moderators generally kind of discuss them as a group before choosing, so there's a little bit of a conversation happening, but it is happening at the moderator level. But sometimes they do get people who just they don't like the political opinions of something, and so they think they should go and respond to that. The groups try not to do that, but it does happen sometimes. But as a whole, like these groups are generally progressive, right? They are generally supporting progressive values. even if they say that they are non-political, when you actually look at the kinds of things they are responding to, there are things that we would identify as progressive values.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Question. Actually, a couple of comments and then a quick question. You know, there's some aspects of what you're talking about here that are a little bit like bystander research or bystander phenomena, where, you know, one person takes an action and the others feel courage to address or counter that. So there's kind of a, yeah, it is kind of a bystander phenomenon effect there that you're talking about. And then, you know, there's also an element of, I mean, there is kind of a speech norm issue. I mean, it's like, you know, countering perceptions that the hate speech is normative. So it's the more, you know, the more discourse that is out there that counters that norm, the more it potentially influences people to, you know, disbelieve that is the norm, where they might have initially believed that. And so there is a normative issue there. That's a whole nother topic of research. And then just a little question, you know, so it's counter speech, and did you include, or how would you count, you know, memes and mashups and everything else as counter speech? Because obviously those things can be used to, you know, make fun of what somebody says or counter it or something, you know.
Yeah, so absolutely, memes can definitely be counter speech. And depending on the effort, some of them use them more than others. I Am Here does not use them very much, partially because they are trying to really promote a particular kind of discourse. More than any kind of political belief, they're trying to promote a way of speaking to each other. But some of the other groups do, and you see them a lot on also on Instagram. There are some accounts on Instagram that do a lot of kind of funny images as responses to speech. The bystander effect question is really interesting because we're actually finding the opposite of what the bystander effect suggests, right? Because the bystander effect suggests that the action of one person can discourage the action of others because they feel like the action has already been taken. And we're seeing kind of the opposite, that once one person takes an action, more people flood in to do it, which is fascinating, I think, because to me, what it's pointing to is that people are getting something else out of it than just kind of a need to fulfill a duty to respond, right? That there is some other, and you hear this in the interviews that I've done with people, that there's also this really, one way of thinking about the success of counter speech is that it has this positive impact on the counter speaker, right? That they feel better about who they are as a citizen and as a member of a political community because they are responding and because they can be seen to be responding by others, which is maybe different than some of the other what some of the other research has shown before. So I think there's more research that can be done kind of on that the relationship with the bystander effect.
And I would imagine just in terms of trying to capture, how you count or how you evaluate something as counter speech. I mean, if memes and mashups and other things are involved, I mean, those are complex, packed, communicative symbols. And
well, and so we have generally, I mean, that's why we don't, when we think about kind of what counts as counter speech, our definition has been, we've tried to keep it pretty open because there are so many ways that people respond. Yeah. We generally think of it as a direct response, which differentiates it from counter narrative. This is kind of getting into the weeds, but where counter narrative is kind of responding to a general belief or a general phenomena, right? Counter speech, we're saying this is a response to one person's specific piece of speech. But we've also learned from especially doing, and this is a project that we're working on now, of doing work with a group that we have kind of loosely, again, for lack of a better term, called at-risk counter speakers. So people who are counter speaking under authoritarian governments or counter speaking in situations where their life is actually put in danger through their work, that their counter speech looks really different because they're not doing these direct head-on engagements, because that would be crazy. You would really like put yourself in major danger doing that. And so theirs looks a little more indirect, but kind of everyone who is within the context understands that that's what's happening, even if they aren't tagging the person.
Codes and registers and everything else that you have to deal with.
Yeah. Thank you.
Kathy, Emily, if I could just ask you to be patient for one. I wanted to get to another question. Kathy, I remember you shared with us what you learned about, the numbers and how those matter, that the messages will rise to the top, and the importance of having a group support your cyberback. But can you remind me how the groups know that they are successful in changing people's speech away from being hateful, even if it's quantitative? Thanks.
Yeah, so they don't always know if they're being successful, right? They know that they're able to get their comments to the top of the comment list, and occasionally they get, every once in a while, they have some stories about people saying, oh, thanks, I didn't know, and changing their mind, right? But it's kind of an act of hope that they think they are having some positive impact. And what
Yeah.
I didn't mention, I didn't really go into detail about the way that this work has affected other researchers, but I've had a lot of really interesting conversations with quantitative researchers who are saying, how do we measure this, right? Like, how do you measure the impact that online speech is having on a reading audience or a silent audience who's not participating? We don't even know who's in that audience. How do you possibly measure the impact? And so even if that would be the most accurate way to look at the success of what people are trying to do, actually getting our heads around how to design a study that is responsive to that goal is very difficult. So they don't always know. Like, it's more anecdotal how they will say that they heard someone, somebody will every once in a while write that they had an impact, or they can kind of feel when they join a comment thread that's been largely negative, and then once they join it, then they start to see other comments coming in. A lot of people talked about they felt like success would be when the comments that were being added looked like comments from I Am Here, but were not coming from I Am Here members, right? So when there were people who were not members who were feeling brave enough to also enter those conversations and stand up, or to be upstanders, that they would be happy with that outcome. And that is a little more visible than kind of the impact on the invisible, the silent audience, but it has not been well measured yet.
Emily, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, first of all, Kathy. I really enjoyed it. In line with the last question, did you see, or were you able to observe or find any type of efforts in consensus building with the other?
Yes. So there's a really interesting project called The Commons. I don't know if anyone's heard about this. It comes out of an organization called Build Up, which does work on kind of peace building in tech, right? And they have a project called The Commons that started off inviting people. It's a depolarization exercise, right? That they would kind of approach people that they, I'm trying to remember how they initially recruit people, but basically they would approach people who were commenting on political articles and invite them to a Facebook group that was going to be, that was openly kind of a depolarization group, and then invite them to have these conversations with members from the other political viewpoint. They've had some success. I think that it's not hugely scalable because it really is like a lot of moderating work with a small group of people. But yeah, I think that's kind of the most well-known one that I've seen about consensus building, of bringing people together on the coming from different viewpoints. There might be others, but that's really the one that sticks out in my mind.
That's very interesting. Actually, there are a whole series of techniques that can be used around this area. And one of them, for example, has been a type of role playing where guerrillas, for example, of the guerrilla in Colombia, became ministers, and ministers became guerrilla. And they began to see each other in different lights. And they were all dying of laughter and of a sight joy because they were able to find common ground through this discourse. There are just a lot of different, that's just one of many, many stories where you can use techniques of consensus building to bring together the people. Oh, in the long run, that's what's going to allow our society to find, well, it's one of the ways that our society will find some greater unity, but it is a challenging. But thank you so much for your work. It's very interesting.
You're welcome. And I thought of one more that maybe you'll find interesting. And this is a podcast if anyone wants to listen. There's a really fascinating podcast from a guy named Dylan Marin called Conversations with People Who Hate Me. So he's kind of a celebrity, and he wrote to people who had commented about his sexuality or his ethnicity and said that he was a terrible person for these things, and reached out to them and asked if they would be willing to have a recorded phone call. And he really believes, empathy is his guiding mission, and had these very empathetic phone calls with people and tried to kind of work through why they thought it was okay to send this terrible email to him or post on his social media account. And the conversations are very interesting. We had an event in DC before the pandemic called A Debate About Hate, where we brought Dylan together with a guy named Logan Smith, who started a Twitter account called Yes, You're Racist. Now Logan takes a very different approach and just searches on Twitter, or he used to searches on Twitter for people who said, I'm not a racist, but, inevitably followed by something very racist. And he would just retweet it. Yes, you're racist. Yes, you're racist. Right. And they debated whether or not it was a good use of energy to speak to these people. And Dylan obviously believes that it is very useful. And Logan said, look, I'm not spending my short time here on Earth talking to neo-Nazis. That's not what I want to do. I want to do something different and have a different kind of impact. So I think that there are real debates among counter speakers about kind of how to go about responding and who is worth responding to and who's not.
Thank you. I encourage you to continue your studies on this.
Thank you. Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Kathy, as you were talking, and I don't think this falls into research, but a couple of just words that came up, for example, empathy, talking about these podcasts. And of course, I often talk with my students about empathy and ethnography and how these two things really kind of go hand in glove. I'm wondering, I'm thinking of Sherry Turkle at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who's really concerned about social media and, all of these devices and what that means in terms of particularly for young people developing empathy. So this is not exactly dangerous speech stuff, but I know that you're a mother and, you have kids, and a lot of us have, deal with these issues. When does your child get a cell phone or something to be able to text? But I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts about that in terms of empathy? Can online, does that, is that part of maybe what that collective drive, that there's a sense of shared empathy or purpose in terms of, that other thing that people are getting out of contributing to collective counter speech?
I do think that there is something there. I also think that for many of the people that I spoke with, they had this kind of very interesting shared narrative of feeling alienated online before they found this group, of seeing the discourse change. I imagine many of you have had this experience maybe once or twice in your life. I certainly have, of seeing how quickly discourse norms have shifted, especially recently in the US, and thinking what is happening, right? And they would say I did not believe that they would say, I didn't believe anybody else in my country felt this way. And now it's all I see everywhere. Has my country moved beyond me? Do I not fit into this political community anymore? And then finding a group where people did believe the same things they did and did still believe that it was worth having these conversations, and that they could be improved and it was worth fighting for, was a very, it made them feel when they talked about not being alone, they talked about it both as in now I'm, counter speaking with other people, but also alone in this larger sense, right? I'm not alone in the belief that this speech is wrong and that someone should say something. So I think that there is something there. Social media is a beast, right? I think that it is, and it feels way bigger than we could ever have an impact on. And so to feel like there is a model, I think especially with I Am Here, whether or not the model works, there is a clear model and people kind of have their directions that they can pour themselves into and follow this model. And there are rituals that happen every day, that the action posts come out at a particular time, like people are doing them on their way to work, on commuting and things like that, it does kind of provide a way to move through it that makes sense to people. What otherwise can seem like chaos, right? And so I think that is part of the draw to it, of feeling like someone has to do something, and here is something that I can do that's relatively easy, because the work of finding the bad speech is being done for me. All I have to do is click like on someone else's comments when I'm tired, and I can still have an impact. Yeah. And the larger question of when we should give kids cell phones, I don't know. I don't know. I do think we have to, this is the way we communicate as people these days. We have to kind of make peace with the fact that this is how it's going to be, and we have to figure out how to do it in a way that's not destructive.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. Really appreciate it. And Deborah and Olive both had other things a little earlier on the West Coast, and so they're not here, but I want to thank all of our speakers, Olive and Deborah and Kathy, for some great presentations, really stimulating, and thank everybody who came and is still here for a great evening. So now I'd like to turn it over to our current WAPA president, Suzanne Hurton, in case she has some closing comments.
Well, I just want to say thank you. This was fantastic. All of the presentations, this was not that I didn't expect them to be good, but wow, really good. And as somebody who spends entirely too much time getting sucked into reading Quora conversations, I'm so happy to hear that there are people doing what you're doing and the people that you studied. So thanks to everybody.